We're going to item 11, which is endorsement of the Global Street Design Guide, and welcome George Weeks. Good morning, George.
Morning, committee.
Come on up, and we'll just make sure we've got our quorum around the table.
Okay, I should have some slides.
You do. We've got them on the system here, and we're ready to go when you're ready to go, George.
Okay, fantastic. As soon as we have quorum, I should begin.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Darby. Okay, thank you, everybody. My name's George Weeks. I'm a principal urban designer at the Auckland Design Office, and I'm joined by my colleague from Auckland Transport, Principal Technical Specialist Chris Beasley. And the reason I'm here is that the City of Auckland has been invited to endorse a new Global Streets Design Guide, and I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes or so just talking about this guide and how it relates to our own best practice and why we've been asked to endorse it. Now, this guide is one of a series of documents produced by or for an organisation called NACTO, which stands for the National Association of City Transportation Officials. It's an American organisation, internationally focused, and its mission is to build cities as places for people with safe, sustainable, equitable and accessible transportation choices that support a strong economy and a vibrant quality of life. And these here are examples of the kind of best practice they produce. And the international branch of NACTO is called the Global Designing Cities Initiative. This is headed by a New Zealander called Skye Duncan. And the Global Designing Cities Initiative recognises the critical role of streets in the urban environment and how they influence quality of life. And this has produced the Global Street Design Guide, this blue document here, which we have been invited to endorse. Now, this was published last year, and it sets a new global baseline for designing urban streets. I mean, as you can see from the figures yourself, it was a vast and international undertaking, drawing on best practice from around the world. 72 cities, 42 countries, 21 different street typologies, and 40 case studies. And significantly, of these 40 case studies from around the world, 3 of them are actually from Auckland. These are Elliott Street, Fort Street, and Angelico Street. I mean, increasingly, Auckland, we're showing the rest of the world how to do good streets. And we are writing our own book on the subject. Over the past couple of years, Auckland Council and Auckland Transport have been working together to produce best practice street design guidance based on the Global Street Design Guide, but localised for Auckland. So we have the Auckland Urban Street and Road Design Guide and our Roads and Streets Framework. So the fact that we've been asked to endorse the Global Street Design Guide is a reflection of the fact that it's very much consistent with our own forthcoming guidance. This relates to Auckland planning policy as well. This is just to talk about how the Auckland plan and its stipulations about considering movement and place for street design is reflected in our own transport design manual, i.e. this document here, which in turn relates back to the Global Street Design Guide. So it's very much inherent with our own guidance and also with our own planning policy as well.
Can you point to the other screen as well for the benefit of members over here?
Okay, of course, yes. So we have planning policy relating to our roads and streets framework, which sets out strategic configurations of streets, and then the transport design manual being the document here, which is our local version of the Global Street Design Guide. And I mentioned earlier that it's about what we've done is that we've localised the principles to be appropriate for a New Zealand context. So let's just look at a few examples in more detail. I mean, here we have streets in a neighbourhood context. You can see there's a list of 21 different street types. This is from the Global Guide. Before you can talk about new streets, you need to understand what the streets in your city do. So this is the Global Guide, and this is the Auckland equivalent. As you can see, there are fewer street types, and then also this grid here is more reflective of the Auckland suburban street grid and the parks and natural features of our city. So we're taking the same principles, but we're localising it, simplifying it, making it appropriate for Auckland. And this also applies to the design of individual streets. This is what's called the public transport street from the Global Street Design Guide. As you can see, this is quite a busy street. We've got people walking, we've got cafe space, it's easy to cross, we've got food courts, we have trees providing shade and shelter. And also, as you can see, there's light rail vehicles, and unless you count the Motat tram, Auckland doesn't yet have any light rail. So the Auckland version...
Wynyard.
Oh, indeed. I stand corrected, thank you.
Better than nothing.
Yeah, in any case, the Auckland equivalent of in the Auckland design manual for the public transport street is this version here, which still has the tree planting, still has the wide pavements, but it very much is based on buses, because for the most public transport corridors in Auckland, they're going to be bus-based, and also there is space for general traffic as well, again reflecting the Auckland context. And also just small things like the fact we have canopies here, that reflects the Auckland typology and our climate. And just one final example is something called the neighbourhood connector. Again, this is the global version, and this street's doing lots of different jobs. It allows cars to move, buses to move, space to park a car, space to cycle, space to park a bicycle. There are shops, cafes, pubs. Very easy to cross the road. There's trees that provide shade in hot weather and shelter in bad weather. But the question is, how do we make this more Auckland? Well, this is the Auckland version. So as you can see, the buildings are set back further from the road. This is very common outside the town centres in Auckland. The overall density is lower. Again, this reflects the Auckland context. People are driving and cycling on the correct side of the road. This, again, is correct with Auckland. But we still have the tree planting, the space to walk, the space to drive, the space to park, the space to cycle, the space to cross. So, once more, this is the kind of treatment which we see between the two documents, international precedent, localised for Auckland. So, to conclude, Auckland is increasingly one of the world's leading cities in street design. We need to be proud of this. And we've recognised that good streets, such as we see it here at Hobsonville, are essential for good neighbourhoods. A first-class city cannot succeed with second-rate streets. So by endorsing the Global Street Design Guide, Auckland will show that it is committed to delivering the highest quality urban realm while learning from and influencing international best practice. So thank you all for listening, and I do have a question from Councillor Newman.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Councillor Newman, for posting that question earlier. It was a very good question. George, you've got a reply.
I do indeed.
Question.
George is just about to come to the question and the reply.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the question is, how does the design approach outlined in the guide, including the reallocation of road space towards public transport and active modes, paragraph 8, reconcile with existing streets that complement the predominant housing typology? This is particularly relevant in outer suburban communities where occupancy is based on highly capitalised single houses on a standalone section that will continue to require the use of private vehicles as the main form of transport. So that's the question. And the answer, okay, is that the Global Street Design Guide and the Auckland Transport Design Manual, they recognise that successful streets have to perform many functions. Streets have to be able to move cars and other types of vehicles like trucks and buses. Our streets need to allow people to travel by bicycle or on foot, and they need to address a whole series of place functions. And this is very much consistent with the Auckland plan. I can give you the paragraphs if you like, and also with the Mayor's letter of expectation to Auckland Transport, which specifically calls for reallocation of road space. Similarly, the unitary plan emphasises the need for streets to balance the role of movement for vehicles and place for people. And I mean, that said, I mean, urban design must always be informed by the local and regional context. In Auckland, the Roads and Streets Framework will provide the direction for balancing movement and place over 9 typologies, and the Transport Design Manual, which I've touched upon briefly today, will provide more detail. It doesn't dictate what you must do, it sets out what you can do. And the Roads and Streets Framework and the Transport Design Manual recognise that some roads and streets in Auckland may require private vehicles as the main form of transport. However, even if an area has a high car mode share, it's unlikely that this is the only function of a street, and its design will need to reflect all of the uses. And fundamentally, this is about increasing people's transport options. I mean, Auckland's a growing city. The Auckland Transport Alignment Project recognises that most growth in travel demand will need to be accommodated on the existing networks, and we need to be much smarter about how we use them. And by designing streets that favour walker, cycling and public transport, these modes will be more available to more people for many more journeys, giving the freedom of the city to everyone, not just those in cars, and making Auckland a better place to live. So I hope that addresses the question.
Thank you, George. It was a very good question. I hope it was a very good answer. Councillor Newman, were you
Yes.
satisfied with the answer? Do you have a supplementary?
Oh, I have more follow-ups. Am I in front of the queue, am I? Or?
You asked the first question, so I'll go straight to you.
Look, thank you for the report. I'm not necessarily sold on this, to be honest, but I don't want to be dog in a manger, but George, it seems to me this would be an easier guide to apply for a new community, much harder to apply in disrupting an existing community which is informed by long-standing patterns of design. I know that there is an attempt to try and improve PT, but in a road corridor, particularly in an outer suburban neighbourhood, that's going to be very, very hard. So is this primarily a document for new neighbourhoods, or are you green fields, or where does this come in? And I might have another question after that.
I think I'd like to defer to my colleague Chris on this, because Chris has been involved with the Transport Design Manual in relation to the Global Street Design Guide and can comment with more expertise on it than me. So,
Welcome, Chris. Chris is from
Welcome,
Auckland
Chris.
Transport.
Thank you. Right, so firstly, I would like to point out that on the 24th of May, we will be coming to a committee workshop on the Roads and Streets Framework and the Transport Design Manual, which will effectively give a lot more depth and detail to what we have done in terms of localising this international approach and fitting it to the Auckland context. And to answer the question, the provision of modal space and modal priorities in existing areas, the roads and streets will define how that is achieved based upon the local context, the wishes, the use, the future aspirations in terms of planning, zone changes, development. So if it's existing, if you're in an outer suburb area that is predominantly served by car now, unless the planning is likely to change, you would maybe not look to change it. What the design guides will try and do is that within the realms of those outcomes trying to seek, determine or assist the best way to accommodate the users that are proposed in that space. So if a street is not proposed to have public transport, you wouldn't try and accommodate them. If the majority mode share is car, they would be the priority most likely, but you would still be trying to make sure people can walk safely and effectively through the corridors.
Reserve the right to speak.
That's not what they're doing in Amity.
Reserve the right to speak.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Couple of questions. Obviously, I haven't seen it, but I'm making the assumption that sustainable design principles around stormwater and the like are included in this approach.
Yep. Both the Global Street Design Guide has a significant chapter on what they term blue-green.
Okay, that'll do. And the other question is, sure, there's a need for our council to address urban streets, but then we've got a lot of rural streets. Are we working on that? And is there something comparable in that space that also meets international best practice and the blue-green and so on?
So that goes beyond what the Global Design Guide was produced for. That was very much produced around that urbanised centre. Within Auckland Transport, the next guide off the rank, once we get these ones out, will be the Rural Roads and Street Design Guide.
Any timeline on that? Because there's some urgency around that.
I can't say completion yet, but it's starting right now. We're starting to flesh out what the guide needs to contain, how it needs to work with the work that Auckland Transport and NZTA are doing in the rural areas.
Sure.
Work with it.
And just my context around that, Mr. Chair, the amount of pollutants that run off rural streets, lime wash, sediment is phenomenal. So it's a priority for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Hulse.
I'm happy to speak to the recommendation, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, just a question, again, from more of a suburban perspective. One of the, relatively recent phenomena that I've noticed in my ward is that the huge increase of people actually parking on the street. So as a consequence of, flooding and cheap Japanese imports, etc., etc. So you now have quite out of the way places that aren't necessarily all that well served by public transport, but they have cars everywhere, and basically on a permanent basis. So once the people come there, it's overnight, and that aesthetically speaking, it's not pleasant, and certainly in terms of movement on bikes and even cars, the whole public element, even of the roadway, is compromised by this basically private taking up of public space. Does the design guide or you have anything to say about that?
Well, I mean, it does say how you may design streets. And how one does or does not accommodate parking is part of that. I mean, car parking can be accommodated successfully into a streetscape if it is thought about.
I guess I'm dealing with a situation where there's now a lot more people renting, there's a lot more car ownership, and I'm just speaking again from my own ward. That's really impacting on public streets, and I don't see a solution in that there's not room on the properties often, or there's other cars in there. So this is just a de facto utilisation of public space on a semi-permanent basis.
So, again, going back to the Global Design Guide, which I believe is what's being sought endorsement on, that really won't cover that sort of suburban context because it was never designed around that. However, what I'd like to say is if we can defer that question to the 24th of May workshop, because we'll deal with it then in terms of the Auckland-specific responses to how we'll approach it from a strategic position and then our own implementation, as I think it would best serve there.
Yep, fine, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I've got some questions, but probably more to you, Chris. First of all, I'm reading in the report that Auckland Transport is currently developing their design manual, which clearly and deliberately is based on the guide's principles. So in one hand, we're being asked to endorse the vision and principles of the design, but Auckland Transport are already, according to the absolute words, deliberately based on the guide's principles, right? I haven't finished my question. I go to the local board views, and you've already completed workshops with the local boards on that framework, and you've said that their feedback will be considered and changes made to the final document. I want to know what local boards have said that matches the principles, more importantly what doesn't match the principles, and that's not in the report. So 2 questions. Why has Auckland Transport deliberately based their design manual on these guide principles? And 2, have the local boards in their feedback on how these would potentially apply to their communities, given any feedback which are contrary to the design principles?
So with local boards, they haven't given any feedback yet on the main documents. They'll be getting those shortly to actually go through in detail. So we've been presenting to them on the topics, giving them extracts from it for their consideration and discussion. But the full 300-400 page documents they haven't yet seen.
Right, nor have we.
No, you have not.
So this is just in principle. Okay, and the second question is, can you tell me a little bit about Skye Duncan? He's a New Zealander, I know, but does he have anything to do with Auckland? She. It's a she.
Do you know much about her?
Other than that, Skye Duncan.
Okay.
No.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I have to confess, Skye's actually a friend of mine, so I can tell you a little bit about Skye.
Okay, can you tell me
very
later, that's
briefly.
right. And my third...
And she's very good at what she does, works with extraordinary people like Michael Bloomberg, and she's set out to do this amazing work around the globe, which has extraordinary results.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you,
my
Councillor Hulls.
last question, sorry. If we endorse A as written in the recommendation, and does that limit us from, if there are circumstances for whatever reason that actually are contrary to, does it let me start this again. Does it prohibit communities of making decisions that are against those design principles if there are extraordinary circumstances, whatever they may be?
No.
It's a guide.
We have, no.
Statutory document, isn't it? Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Councillor Mickley.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I was very impressed. I was particularly interested in the slide that depicted an ideal urban street, in an urban street with a tram. And obviously, streets are multi-use, people live, work, shop, and also travel through them. And so all of that has to be taken into account. And it seems to me that apart from the technical superiority of light rail vehicles carrying masses of people quietly and powerfully with no emissions, there's also another factor relating to trams, and that is kind of an amenity factor that buses don't have. In Europe, you see trams going through medieval city squares past cathedrals, and it works, somehow works. I have not seen any academic papers on this aspect of light rail in inner cities, the city building amenity factor, something, you know, if you've got 300 people going on an electric tram through a city, you'd need about 7 or 8 buses to carry the same amount of people. The impact is totally different. But is there any work or papers on the amenity factor of light rail in a city environment?
I think we have to defer that because I don't know.
It's a kind of a given, isn't it? But I haven't seen it.
I'd imagine that there will be research produced by kind of Gold Coast, Sydney.
Because we're in transition, you know,
It's a mountain.
people are talking about trams and light rail. Government at this stage is not supporting it. We've gone off on a tangent talking about trams to the airport, but it's the inner city is where that's where the trams would be so important. So eventually they will come, and I think we need to be factoring that in.
Thank you. Councillor Quicks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris, I just want to take you back to your answer to Councillor Newman's question. And if I understood you correctly, when it comes to those suburban type streets where there is already a well-defined pattern of travel, you wouldn't be looking to change those. Is that, did I hear you correctly?
You may not.
Okay.
It's a very careful answer because you may choose strategically to change for various reasons, but then you may not. And it's only when you start looking at the use of those corridors, what the surrounding uses, where the destination origin points are, land use expectations, land use developments into the future, that you may look at it. Where I sit, I don't deal with that. That is what is done at the Roads and Streets framework level, is sets those change, those outcomes. And so, again, I'd probably say that better off talking about that on the 24th of May,
Okay.
where we can actually really dive into detail on those points and how that will work.
Right. Because I'm referring specifically, I guess, or I'm thinking specifically of Amity Stage 2, between the Pakuranga town centre and the Panmure railway station, where the proposal is to remove one lane of traffic, private motor vehicle traffic in each direction, and replace it with the bus lanes, walking and cycling. And while I've asked for evidence from Auckland Transport how that will ease congestion, they don't seem to have been very forthcoming with that. I wonder if you have any ideas around how that will ease removing half the traffic lanes in an area where currently only 2% of public transport is utilised. What are your views on removing private traffic lanes?
Without knowing the specifics of that project, what I would say is that productivity of a corridor is sometimes a key performance to look at, and what the future provisioning should be. That's probably about the limit of really where I would say, because I'm not an expert in strategic planning. I'm a designer, so
Okay.
I would be saying things out of turn if I'd gone down that.
All right, okay, I understand your limitations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, councillor Quicks. Just in terms of, we've had access to this document, but my understanding, and maybe correct me, I should pose it as a question. I understand it's the philanthropy of Michael Bloomberg's foundation which is sitting in behind funding all this. Is that correct?
Yes, it's funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies.
So by adopting it, at the moment you've got sort of some access to it, but would I be correct in saying by signing up to it, then we've got a deeper access into the technical group that Michael Bloomberg's foundation supports at no cost to us?
I believe that is the case. Effectively, if you sign up and join as part of this NACTO global community, you get access to all their technical publications, their safety reports globally that you can then draw upon and utilise in your own research, your own framing of questions and responses.
And it's also worth mentioning, in addition to that, that Auckland is one of 70 member cities of the Global Designing Cities Initiative.
Thank you. Thanks, members. Do I have oh, sorry, I've got a further question. Member Hanare and then the Deputy Mayor.
Kia ora, fellows. Double-barrelled question. In the global scheme of things, what's the Indigenous input into this sort of global design? And more in particular, in terms of New Zealand, what's the Māori input into urban design? In terms of what you're doing.
Well, I mean, the document that we're doing, the Auckland Transport Design Manual has been localised based upon global principles. I think in the report that was circulated, that there was a Maori statement in relation to how Maori engagement.
Yeah, I don't really want to know. I mean, I've seen it and read it, and I don't want to really know but that sort of what you're pointing me to is what I've already read. But what is the Māori design? What's the input? Because it doesn't really say. All it says is you basically talk to a couple of people and.
So at the global level, NACTO probably, I don't know what NACTO is doing with Indigenous people. It's written by a conglomerate of different nations, so that I would suspect it's probably fairly light, if not touching at all. For our work, we have been engaged with Mana Whenua through various workshops to try and emphasise and try and pick up on the key points that are important, so we can try and reflect them. We've also been bringing in the Te Ranga principles into the guide itself to try and provide some guidance to reflect the cultural identities and cultural requirements for the project.
Just on that, while the global document doesn't reflect local context, like you say Auckland or wider New Zealand, let alone cultural context, the document that we're working on, that's the subset that reflects the local, and it will reflect the cultural context. And there is clear intention, like we're looking at public buildings and Māori design principles and genuine inputs. Not
You
just,
should be over there.
so the
And through the chair, I think
it will be reflected.
and we will take you through that in the workshop as well, where we'll show you either examples and or drafts
Yes.
of ensuring that we've got the Te Ranga design principles and others as part of our localising of the guide.
Cool.
Will you be deferring this item?
Yeah, till the workshop's had.
No, I don't think there's a case to defer it. This is the higher level document. We're at this stage enjoying the opportunity to access NACTO, but by signing up to it, we get an even deeper access into that organisation. And as Councillor Hulse has witnessed with C40, this is at no cost to us. We're actually getting a tremendous resource. There are literally hundreds of technicians working on this, which we can get access to. I will go to the Deputy Mayor next.
Yeah, very quickly, Mr Chair. So I completely understand the international global context of this, and what Tao's referring to is what's the Kiwi Iwi version 2 of this, and that's what we're going to see on the 24th. Sadly, I'm not going to be here on the 24th, otherwise I'd have this question for you then. But what will we have an influence from in greenfields? And I have to go for the people in the northwest and the south, where we're seeing what was once growing lands or grass paddocks being turned into urban to a greater or lesser degree, depending on where you're going. But the lands beyond that are still commercial, rural lands, and we are seeing in some cases streetscapes being created that don't allow for the movement of heavy traffic. And sometimes those heavy traffic is consistent. So I was very glad to hear about you talking on a regional context when these plans come through. But something very careful to bear in mind, that an urban design dropped into those sort of environments where there's not secondary alternative transport routes, and in some cases some of these transport routes are being determined by environment court hearings. There needs to be some considerable thought put in that. We've had a couple of very bad case studies in the past couple of years.
Good points. Now, Deputy Mayor, you were going to move?
Oh, happy to move, Mr Chair.
Do I have a second? Councillor Hulse, thank you. It's there for us all. Councillor Newman.
My concern about this is what happens is that a principles document like this is, of course, it becomes the stuff of design work, a manual that Auckland Transport will undertake, and all of that has to be consistent with our planning document, which is the unitary plan. And in the unitary plan, we've got regional policy statement provisions, objectives and policies, and just looking at B2.2, it sets out the quality compact urban form that enables the following, blah, blah, blah. 1D, improved and more effective public transport. So what tends to happen is that we have this rule book, and we have these design manuals that come in to inform all of that. And so that to me is how you start to contextualise these principles documents. The problem is that I represent an outer suburban community where it becomes a bit tough, because the nature of it is that these are highly capitalised neighbourhoods. You're not changing the urban form of those neighbourhoods in the next 5, 10, 20 years, maybe in generations. But of course, what we talk about with this sort of thing, Mr Chair, is future aspirations. Well, I'm talking about current communities where the car is still very, very important, because these neighbourhoods are quite dispersed with quite low density housing. I can understand this is a bit easier for high density housing. So, I mean, I'm not really that sold on it, but saying that, Mr Chair, this is hardly what you'd call, I mean, it's endorsing a vision and principles. It doesn't seem to be so unreasonable as to not support it, but I would be very interested to ensure that actually when it comes to future structure planning for greenfield sites, that we are ensuring that the very concerns that actually Bill Cashmore raised about balancing out the needs for multimodal access in the road corridor, that we are still reflecting the fact that we will need the means for private vehicles and commercial vehicles to have access through those corridors, because they remain the lifeblood of competitive enterprise, and they remain the primary means to move people around. So, you know, I mean, I'm not sure if that was at all useful, Mr Chair, but you know, I'm not really that hot on this, but it doesn't seem to be that something that's so urgent that it needs to be opposed. But I certainly hope that we'll be finding at this workshop that the application of it will be very much something that transport planners can use for new communities, but that we will not destroy access for private vehicles, because they remain significant.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hulse?
Thank you. I am quite hot on this. And the reason why is I've seen some of this in action. Councillor Cooper and I both understand how this has worked out west, and having been part of the design of Hobsonville, it's now used as best practice. There was a lot of concern raised that ambulances, fire engines and delivery trucks wouldn't be able to get through. They absolutely can. I think the hierarchy of the road corridor remains, and the design is apportioned accordingly. So you wouldn't, have a narrow tree-lined street replacing Lincoln Road. However, a street like Lincoln Road, which is going to be redesigned utilising these guidelines, could transform an arterial route from a car drain into an economic generator and a life improver. And that's what this is about. So I cannot fathom why we wouldn't be wanting to access every part of the guidelines that are available to us. The bottom line around this is that it's forward focused, and it's looking at addressing the issues that Councillor Walker raised around stormwater, around our environmental principles, and even the issues that Councillor Quacks has raised about congestion and replacing lanes with multimodal opportunities. This is not a congestion solver. Congestion is with us in Auckland. It's how we manage it, and this says let's manage it by improving the experience daily on these corridors. Let's manage it by turning these road corridors into places that make sense for Aucklanders, and not every Aucklander, believe you me, wants to use their car every day. People are crying out for alternatives to cycle, to walk and to use public transport, and I think those of us who think that only cars are used are a decreasing demographic. So the bottom line with this is let's utilise this extraordinary opportunity. Let's utilise something that we have already done well in parts of the region, and let's see this rolled out throughout the entire region. Will it go rapidly redeveloping roads in our peri-urban areas? Of course not. Will it mean that an area like Lincoln Road that is slated for redevelopment will finally be done well with creativity and according to international best practice? Yes. Will it transform our city? Absolutely. And having just come from, and my apologies for being late, from a meeting of our collective sports organisations, we have an overwhelming endorsement from millions of sports users, millions meaning on a weekly basis, to improve the experience of the road corridor and provide alternatives to get walking, cycling, running and active. And I restate again, Mr Chair, this is our answer to doing that, if we can finally forward face rather than backward look.
Thank you, Councillor Hulse. We'll put Councillor Simpson, please.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Look, I suppose I feel that my knowledge on this would have been further enhanced by having the workshop first, I'll be straight up. To that end, I wondered if you would consider, as Deputy Mayor, as the mover, just noting in A that there may be exceptions to this. So that kind of gives us a little bit of flexibility for those potentially who are a little bit nervous, and I hear what Councillor Newman's saying, I heard what Councillor Quacks is saying, but I think in essence the overriding vision is out there, but there may be exceptions, and we don't know what they are, or case by case or whatever. It's not, I asked the questions directly, does it lock us in for everything? And the answer was no. So if you added that kind of noting at the end, maybe that keeps everybody happier.
Well, you do know that because you've had the answer,
So it's
and it's a
principles.
recorded answer.
Don't put it
We need to note it, members, because
No.
I think we're
No.
hearing the answer,
Okay.
and then you're noting it. And really, we need to resolve rather than note. That would be my view.
Well, your B is a note anyway.
Yeah, well, that's just reminding us that we've got that workshop coming up. You okay, Councillor Simpson?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Councillor Cooper?
Thank you. Having listened to everybody's concerns and praises, you have to endorse this. It's a guide. It's not a statutory document, but it gives the local boards which we've been reassured when you're doing local planning, local streets, that the local boards will have another tool to look at and contemplate and see whether there's parts of that would really work for their communities. And I think maybe apart from Councillor Newman, some of us who've been speaking, having quite concerns around this, have probably all grown up in similar time eras. And my grandfather's just moved out of his house in Balmoral Road after living there for 70 years. And so I spent a lot of time in Balmoral in that shopping centre as a young girl. And what I've noticed about it is the quality has decreased. This is about quality of life. It's not. It's about getting around, but it's actually about quality of life in communities. And I think that the quality of life then, when there were less cars, was actually, as a young child, 6 and 7, 8, I could be walking around there quite happily and safely. You wouldn't let a kid of that age do that now. And I think this is what it will bring us back a little bit. We're driving our kids everywhere, even to school when they live locally. This is just crazy sort of stuff. So I think for me, this is another set of, it's a bit like having the catalogue, but it all is comprehensive. And if AT are already adopting these things, that makes, real sense. And you've seen that even in communities where they're car dominated, which is one in which I live. We do have a ferry, but we have no other relevant public transport. There are a lot of cars, and we're getting those effects, as Councillor Watson talks about, where everybody's kid's got a car and they're all parked on the streets. But the reality is, if we can retrofit communities to make the parking a bit better for the people that we're getting public transport there and we're making it pleasant. We've seen at Hobsonville, people were all worried about, intensifying and not having enough car parks. But actually, people are falling over themselves to live there and loving it. Loving the opportunity to walk freely. They've got dedicated cycleways, bus lanes in all the right places. And people love it. And I think that's what we've got to look at. So for me, this is really important to adopt, because it just gives us more ideas. And if we can look at other countries and modify that for us, that's great. I don't think there's anything to be afraid of, because there's no compulsion in this. It's just a guide. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. Councillor Hills.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I want to support this. I think that there isn't anything to be afraid of. This is the way we have to go. This is not, this is not a choice anymore. We don't have any more land to keep bowling houses, to widen roads. I mean, I'd get depressed looking at roads where people have had extreme widening and now their houses are smack bang and their neighbours are miles across the street and they can never walk across, and they literally feels like there's a motorway sitting outside their house on lots of, Lincoln Road for one, other places. We have to think of different ways to design spaces, and a lot of the time that is roads, whether it's walking, cycling, public transport or cars. Roads are the places where we spend a lot of our time. So if we don't design them well and let people feel proud of where they live or where they drive or where they walk around, and it's not safe, as Councillor Cooper said, for kids to just run down to the dairy quickly or walk to school because the design is not there, and we only design it for cars, then we actually start ruining communities, locking everyone back behind 2-metre fences because it's unsafe to let their kids even near the road. And you do go to the best practice places like Hobsonville, and you can walk around there and feel like you're in a park even though it's a street and there's trees around, and it's little walkways between houses and all that sorts of thing. And lots of people don't like the idea of Hobsonville until they go there and walk around and have a look how good the playgrounds connect with the cafe and all that sort of thing. And it's happening all over the world. You look at Paris, they're removing lanes of road from around the river there, and they're putting back boulevards and putting back people. High Street here, I cannot walk up High Street anymore because you are just swallowed by parked cars. So I'd rather go on all the new spaces that we've added in the last 6 or 7 years that are walkable, that are friendly, that people are sitting, waiting, spending money, eating ice creams, having coffees, whatever. It's a way we have to move forward. Like I said the other day, Oniwa Road, you're adding a lot more people down Oniwa Road, but not because we've added more space for cars, it's because we've made sure that the T3 lane is free running, so you're adding a whole lot more buses. We've got shared spaces on the walkways now, so you've got more people using that space ever before, and more people running freely in a congestion-free way. So I get it that we're going to have to give up some things, but we need these type of manuals and overseas examples of good way you retrofit streets and good ways to upgrade greenfield areas as well as brownfield. So, it's happening in our community, Northcote and Takapuna. There's going to be big Panuku upgrades there, and we need this sort of expertise to make sure we're getting the best practice models that bring communities back together instead of just dividing everyone by car. So I think it's exciting. It doesn't tie us into anything, and local boards are all going to have a say on their local communities, but I think this is a step in the right direction, especially to get that expertise from right across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo the concerns that have been expressed by Councillor Watson and also by Councillor Newman, and in regards to some of the issues that arose in the early 2000s when I think Councillor Newman was on the Manukau City Council at the time, some of the issues that arose at the time with the very narrow street corridors that we had around the Dannemora area. And we received a presentation from the fire chief, a Manukau fire chief, said, "Councillor, we've got a problem here. We've got a problem because if you have a fire on one of these streets, we can't get through. We're putting people's lives at danger by the very fact that we can't get to an emergency." So we then gave permission for the Director of Transport at the time to instigate a whole bunch of no parking areas up those streets. And then what people did, of course, was park on the grass berm. And in the grass berm, that's where all our underground utilities were. And so all of a sudden, we resolved one problem and created another. So as long as we are and continue to be a car-dominated society for our travel, you need to think of how the world really revolves, how it really is, not how you wish it to be. And I sometimes think that a lot of these things are how we wish things would be, rather how they are. And we found out in Manukau that things were quite different than what the plans had been in Dannemora with the very narrow road corridors. We found that actually it didn't work that well. We had problems, we put people's lives at risk because of the fact that fire trucks couldn't get through, ambulances couldn't get through, rubbish trucks couldn't get through. And then all of a sudden we found people parking on the road berms and degrading the underground utilities. So it's not quite as rosy as it all sounds. It's wonderful, and I think in the city here, in the inner city, it's been shown that it does have some merit. But in those suburban areas that I represent, Councillor Stewart represents and Councillor Newman represent, and a lot of us represent those suburban areas, it actually doesn't work particularly well.
Thank you, Councillor. Look, I think we've had a good thrash of this. Just speaking briefly, and thanks for those that are supporting this. Look, I want to acknowledge Michael Bloomberg and his foundation for supporting this work. We wouldn't be sitting around having this discussion if it wasn't for the generosity of the former Mayor of New York. And I know sitting in behind this work is Jeanette Siddiq-Khan, his former Transport Director, who some of us know quite well and who has made significant contributions on at least 2 or 3 trips here to Elliott Street and to Fort Street and the others that are within the document and featured there. It would, subject to the vote today, I think, George and Chris, it would be really quite lovely for the Mayor to write to Michael Bloomberg acknowledging the vote today, in anticipation, of course. Look, I love this work. This is the direction that we must take. As Councillor Hill says, there is no treading water status quo. The status quo does not get you very far when you are developing a city at the pace that we're developing. You cannot rely on the old tools in just about any area, and particularly in the transport area. We cannot rely on the old templates. They don't sustain us and will not sustain us. And this does, I think there's some, was it 21 street typologies that are offered, and that's just the baseline. And then you start to reflect, you go locally, and you reflect locally, and you reflect local culture locally as well, as Member Hinare just pointed out. So, you know, this is, I was, some references to South Auckland here. We have one of the most car-dependent parts of Auckland in South Auckland. That's why we rolled out the new bus network there first, because we know, the analysis says, that's where the greatest car dependency is. It was rammed home to me a few years ago, and I always remember it's still in my mind. In my vehicle on Great South Road, on the arterial there, in taking into account its slip lanes at this particular junction, which is just north of Ronwood Avenue, and I think I counted 9 lanes. A very fragile small man had pushed the button to cross. He got his call. He started to walk. The signal changed, and he still had 2 lanes to go, and the horns were going. And this poor little man was just caught in the middle of nowhere with 2 lanes to go, and he struggled those last 2 lanes being blasted by motorists. And that is what you get when you put cars first eternally. And I think we've got to shift that very, very quickly on its access here in Auckland. It's not just in South Auckland though. If I look at my own Taharoto Road, you don't need a bus to go along that road, you need a bus to cross it. And there was a fatality on that road in January this year with a woman attempting to cross that road and got struck by a vehicle. That road is one for your work in the very near future, but there are hundreds of roads that really need to respond to your work in the very near future. But Auckland is riddled with roads, but it is not provided for in terms of streets that provide for people, that provide for place, that provide outstanding quality, that allow people to linger and enjoy streets, let alone the freight and other movement requirements. We've got 9-lane arterials that are impermeable all over the city. And we've got 50-kilometre-an-hour slip lanes. They are dangerous. We know that the chances of surviving when you're struck at 50 kilometres an hour are negligible. You will be a fatality. It will be a fatality. Those slip lanes you will not see in these designs coming through these frameworks. We've got 900mm wide footpaths in this city. You can't pass 2 prams on 900mm, but that is the standard in South Auckland, in North Auckland, and in West Auckland. So we've got a long way to go. This is just the baseline. And I look forward to the workshop and for all of us adopting this document today. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. And declare it carried.